May 1945. The world was on the edge of a new era, but for one terrified teenager, the war was far from over. In the muddy, rain-soaked fields of northwest Germany, a 16-year-old boy named Klouse pressed himself into the cold earth, heart pounding, desperate to disappear. He was just a kid, but the uniform on his back marked him as a soldier of the Third Reich, a regime that was crumbling by the hour. The sky above was gray, heavy with the smoke of distant fires, and every sound in the darkness felt like a death sentence. Klaus's hands shook so badly he could barely grip his rifle, a weapon almost as tall as he was. He'd only learned to fire it a few months ago, but now it was the only thing standing between him and the enemy. He joined the Hitler Youth at 13, back when it felt like a game, marching in sharp uniforms, singing songs that promised glory and brotherhood. But the fantasy had shattered. Now, the only thing Klouse felt was raw, animal terror. Across the field, voices drifted through the mist, English words spoken by Canadian soldiers. For years, Klouse had been told exactly what would happen if he was ever captured by the Allies. His leaders had shown him gruesome photos, told him horror stories about torture and death at the hands of the enemy. They said the Allies were monsters, that surrender meant certain doom, and Klouse believed every word. Propaganda had filled his head with images of cruelty, of men with cold eyes and violent hands. Now, as footsteps crunched closer, those nightmares felt real enough to choke him. He thought of his mother, somewhere in the ruins of Hamburg, and wondered if she even knew he was alive. The last letter he'd received was months ago, before the bombs turned his city into a wasteland. His father was gone, lost on the Eastern Front. His older brother had vanished in France. Klouse was supposed to be the one who survived, but now, in this muddy foxhole, he was sure he'd never see home again. The footsteps stopped right above him. Klouse squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the bullet he'd been told would come. His heart hammered so hard it hurt. He was 16, but fear had stripped away any illusion of adulthood. He was just a boy, trembling in a uniform that hung loose on his thin frame, praying for a miracle. A voice broke the silence, rough, accented German, but not unkind. "Come out, hands up, nobody will hurt you." Klouse didn't believe it. He'd been warned about tricks like this. But the voice came again, softer this time, almost gentle. "Come on, son, the war is over for you, you're safe now." In that moment, everything Klouse had been taught collided with the reality in front of him. He was out of ammunition, starving, and utterly alone. With no other choice, he raised his shaking hands and crawled out of the foxhole, blinking in the sudden sunlight. He expected to see a monster. Instead, he saw a tired man in a Canadian uniform, rifle lowered, eyes filled with something that looked like pity. For Klouse, this was the moment everything changed. The moment when the line between enemy and human began to blur. But what happened next would shatter everything he thought he knew about war, mercy, and the true meaning of power. Before the war turned him into a ghost in a muddy foxhole, Klouse was just another German schoolboy, living in a world that promised greatness but delivered only fear. At 13, he joined the Hitler Youth, swept up in a tidal wave of national pride and carefully crafted lies. The uniforms were crisp, the parades were grand, and the songs echoed with promises of brotherhood and destiny. For a boy growing up in the shadow of defeat and economic ruin, it felt like stepping into a storybook, one where he could be a hero. But behind the banners and slogans, something darker was at work. The Nazi regime knew exactly how to mold children into weapons. Every meeting, every lesson, every film was designed to erase doubt and replace it with loyalty. Klouse learned to march in perfect lines, to salute with precision, to repeat slogans until they became second nature. He was taught that Germany was surrounded by enemies, that only strength and sacrifice could save the fatherland. The world outside was painted as dangerous, full of traitors and monsters who wanted to destroy everything he loved. Propaganda wasn't just a background noise, it was the air he breathed. In classrooms, teachers praised the Fuhrer and warned of the threat from the West. At home, the radio blared speeches about victory and vengeance. Even children's books were filled with stories of brave German boys outsmarting evil foreigners. Klause's world shrank until it was just us and them, good and evil, with no room for questions or doubts. By the time he turned 16, the war was devouring Germany from the inside out. Cities like Hamburg were reduced to rubble by Allied bombs. Food was scarce, and every family had lost someone. The Hitler Youth, once a club for camping and games, became a pipeline straight to the front lines. Klause's childhood ended the day he was handed a rifle and told he was now a soldier. There was no ceremony, no celebration, just orders and fear. Training was brutal. The instructors shouted, belittled, and punished any sign of weakness. Klouse learned to fire his weapon, to dig trenches, to survive on almost nothing. But nothing could prepare him for the reality of war. The first time he saw a dead body, he vomited behind a tree. The first time he heard artillery, he shook so hard he couldn't hold his rifle. But there was no time for fear. The older boys told him to toughen up or die. Every day the propaganda grew louder. Officers warned that the Allies were closing in, that surrender meant torture and death. They showed films of supposed Allied atrocities, photographs of mutilated prisoners, and stories of villages wiped out by enemy savages. Klouse believed it all. He had to. Doubt was dangerous, and hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. The war machine didn't care that he was still a child. It needed bodies, and Klouse was just another number in a uniform too big for his frame. He wrote letters home, trying to sound brave for his mother, but inside he was terrified. He missed his father, lost on the Eastern Front, and his brother, who had vanished in France. He missed the days when his biggest worry was a bad grade or a scraped knee. Now every day was a fight to survive. The boy who once dreamed of being a teacher was gone, replaced by a frightened conscript clinging to the last shreds of hope. But even as the world around him collapsed, Klouse held on to one thing, the belief that he was fighting for something bigger than himself. That was the lie that kept him moving, even as everything else fell apart. But the truth was waiting for him, just beyond the next horizon, a truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew about enemies, mercy, and what it really means to be strong. The moment Klouse heard the footsteps stop above his foxhole, time seemed to freeze. Every nightmare he'd ever been fed by Nazi propaganda came rushing back, images of Allied soldiers as merciless monsters, stories of torture and humiliation, warnings that surrender was a death sentence. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure the enemy could hear it. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the gunshot that would end everything. But instead, a voice cut through the fear, a voice speaking German, rough but not cruel, commanding but not hateful. "Come out, hands up, nobody will hurt you." Klause's mind raced. Was this a trick? He'd been told the Allies would lure you out with promises of safety, only to gun you down the moment you showed your face. Every instinct screamed at him to stay hidden, to fight to the last breath. But he was out of ammunition, starving, and so exhausted he could barely move. The voice came again, softer this time, almost gentle. "Come on, son. The war is over for you. You're safe now." Safe? The word sounded foreign, almost meaningless after years of fear. But Klouse had no choice. With trembling hands, he pushed himself up from the mud, raising his arms high above his head. The sunlight hit his face, blinding him for a moment as he climbed out of the hole. He expected to see a monster, someone with cold eyes and a sneer, ready to strike. Instead, he saw a Canadian corporal, dirt-streaked and weary, lowering his rifle as he looked at Klouse with something like pity. "Jesus, you're just a kid," the corporal muttered in English, then switched back to German. "How old are you?" Klause's voice was barely a whisper. 16, sir." The corporal shook his head, almost in disbelief. He reached into his pack and Klouse flinched, certain this was the moment the violence would start. But instead of a weapon, the Canadian pulled out a battered canteen and a pack of cigarettes. He held them out, waiting patiently as Klouse stared in confusion. Was this another trick? Was the water poisoned? Was the cigarette a trap? But the corporal just waited, his eyes tired but kind. "Here, drink some water, you look half dead." Klause's hand shook as he took the canteen, expecting it to be snatched away at any second. But the Canadian just watched, letting him drink. The water was cold and clean, and Klouse gulped it down so fast he choked. The corporal patted his back until the coughing stopped, then offered him a cigarette. Klouse had only smoked twice before, but he took it, not knowing what else to do. The Canadian lit it for him, and for a moment the world seemed to pause, two enemies, sharing a quiet moment in the aftermath of chaos. All around them, other Canadian soldiers were rounding up more young German prisoners. Klouse saw boys from his unit, faces pale with fear, hands shaking just like his. There were no shouts, no blows, no cruelty. The Canadians organized them into lines, handed out water, checked for wounds. One soldier even put his arm around a crying boy's shoulders, speaking softly in broken German. Klouse watched in disbelief. This was nothing like the horror stories he'd been told. This was not the enemy he'd been trained to hate. As the prisoners were loaded onto trucks, rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered they were being taken to Canada, others insisted it was just another lie before execution. Klouse didn't know what to believe anymore. Everything he'd been taught was unraveling, replaced by a confusing new reality. But one thing was clear. The Canadian corporal could have given him death, but instead, he offered water and a cigarette. That small act of mercy cracked something open inside Klouse, a feeling he couldn't name yet, but one that would change his life forever. But the journey was just beginning. What waited for Klouse across the ocean would challenge everything he thought he knew about enemies, forgiveness, and the true meaning of strength. As the trucks rumbled away from the battlefield, Klouse sat wedged between other young prisoners, his mind spinning with fear and disbelief. The war in Europe was ending, but for these captured German boys, a new chapter was just beginning, one filled with rumors, uncertainty, and the haunting question: what would the victors do with their defeated enemies? The trucks bounced over muddy roads, carrying them to a future none of them could imagine. Whispers spread through the ranks like wildfire. Some said they were being shipped to America, others insisted it was Canada, a place most of them had only seen on maps in school. The word Canada sounded almost mythical, distant, cold, and impossibly far from the ruins of Germany. Some boys clung to hope, imagining a land of forests and lakes, while others were convinced it was just another trick, a final stop before execution or endless hard labor. The journey was long and grueling. They were loaded onto trains, then marched to ports where ships waited, their hulls echoing with the footsteps of hundreds of prisoners. Klouse had never seen the ocean before. The sight of the endless gray water was both terrifying and mesmerizing. As the ship pulled away from the European coast, he pressed his face to the porthole, watching the only world he'd ever known disappear into the mist. Below deck, the air was thick with fear and seasickness. The boys huddled together, trading stories and rumors in hushed voices. Some tried to act brave, but most were just scared kids, far from home, with no idea what awaited them. The food was plain but filling, more than Klouse had eaten in months. Still, every bite tasted like uncertainty. Every night he dreamed of home, of his mother's face, of the city of Hamburg before the bombs. After 2 endless weeks at sea, the ship finally docked. The prisoners were herded onto trains once more, this time rolling through a landscape that looked nothing like the shattered cities of Europe. Klouse stared out the window in awe. The fields were green and endless, dotted with red barns and white farmhouses. There were no bomb craters, no burned-out ruins, no desperate crowds searching for scraps. It was a world untouched by war, a world that felt almost unreal. The train slowed as it approached a place called Lethbridge, Alberta. The name meant nothing to Klouse, but the sight of Camp 133, a sprawling complex surrounded by barbed wire, made his stomach twist with dread. He expected the worst: cold concrete cells, guards with hard eyes, hunger and humiliation. But as he stepped off the train, the reality was nothing like the nightmares he'd been fed. The camp was massive, holding thousands of German prisoners, but it was nothing like the prison camps Klouse had seen in propaganda films. The barracks were wooden, warm, and clean. Each prisoner was given a real bed with thick blankets and a pillow. The mess hall served hot meals, meat, potatoes, bread, and even milk. Klouse stared at his tray in disbelief, certain there had been a mistake. Was this really for him? Was this how the enemy treated their prisoners? The guards spoke English, but some tried their best in German. They didn't shout or threaten. When a boy got sick, the camp doctor treated him with the same care he'd give anyone else. There were no beatings, no cruelty, just rules and routines. Klouse felt his fear begin to fade, replaced by confusion. Everything he'd been taught about the enemy was unraveling, replaced by a reality he couldn't yet understand. But the biggest shock was still to come. In this strange new land, Klouse would discover a kind of mercy and humanity he never thought possible, one that would force him to question everything he'd ever believed about war, enemies, and the true meaning of strength. For Klouse, every day inside Camp 133 felt like waking up in a parallel universe. He had braced himself for cruelty, for hunger, for the kind of punishment he'd been warned about in every Hitler Youth meeting. But what he found instead was a world that seemed almost impossible, a world where the enemy treated him like a human being. The first shock came in the mess hall. On his very first day, Klouse was handed a metal tray and watched as Canadian cooks piled it high with food. There were steaming potatoes, thick slices of bread with real butter, vegetables, and a generous portion of meat, actual meat, not the scraps and gristle he'd grown used to back home. There was even a cup of milk, cold and fresh. Klouse stared at the tray, convinced there had been a mistake. Was this really for him? Was this how prisoners were fed in Canada? He ate slowly, savoring every bite, trying to make the meal last. It was more food than he'd seen in a single sitting in years. Later, he learned that each prisoner received over 3,000 calories a day, more than most German civilians had during the final year of the war. It was a staggering realization. In a world where his mother was likely still hungry in the ruins of Hamburg, Klouse was being fed by the very people he'd been taught to hate. But it wasn't just the food. The barracks were warm and clean, with real beds and thick blankets. There were no dirt floors, no freezing nights spent shivering in the dark. Each morning, Klouse woke up to the sound of birds outside his window, not the distant thunder of bombs. The guards, many of them young Canadians barely older than Klouse himself, treated the prisoners with a strange kind of respect. They enforced the rules, but they didn't shout or strike. When a boy got sick, the camp doctor treated him with medicine and care, not suspicion or cruelty. There was even a canteen where prisoners could buy chocolate bars, chewing gum, and tobacco with the small wages they earned from work details. Klouse bought a chocolate bar with his first pay and ate it slowly, letting the sweetness melt on his tongue. It brought tears to his eyes. He had forgotten what sugar tasted like. Outside the barracks, life was surprisingly full. There were soccer balls and musical instruments. Some prisoners formed a band and played music in the evenings, filling the camp with songs that reminded them of home. Others took classes in English, mathematics, or trade skills. Klouse started keeping a journal, writing down his thoughts in German, trying to make sense of a world that no longer fit the stories he'd been told. But the most astonishing moment came at Christmas. Canadian families from the nearby town of Lethbridge invited young prisoners into their homes for Christmas dinner. Klouse and a handful of other boys were driven into town by a local farmer and his wife. Their house was warm and filled with the smell of roasting turkey and fresh bread. There was a Christmas tree, presents, and laughter. Klouse sat at their table, surrounded by strangers who treated him like a guest, not an enemy. He ate more food than he'd seen in years and cried quietly into his napkin, overwhelmed by kindness he couldn't understand. Every day in Camp 133 chipped away at the lies Klouse had been taught. The Canadians talked about their families, showed pictures of their children, and shared jokes during work breaks. They didn't act like monsters. They acted like people. And for the first time, Klouse began to wonder if everything he'd believed about the enemy and about himself had been a lie. But the real transformation was just beginning. The kindness he found in Canada would force Klouse to confront the darkest truths about war, propaganda, and what it really means to be strong. For Klouse, the hardest battle wasn't fought with bullets or bayonets. It was the war inside his own mind. Every day in Camp 133, he found himself caught between two worlds, the one he'd been taught to believe, and the one unfolding before his eyes. The Nazi propaganda that had shaped his childhood was relentless, painting the Allies as monsters, warning that mercy was weakness and that the enemy would never see him as human. But here, in the heart of Canada, those stories were falling apart. At first, Klouse clung to the old lessons. He watched the guards for any sign of cruelty, flinched at every raised voice, and waited for the moment when the kindness would turn to violence. But it never came. Instead, he saw Canadian soldiers sharing cigarettes with prisoners, laughing at jokes, and talking about their lives back home. He saw medics tending to wounds with gentle hands, cooks slipping extra bread to the hungriest boys, and guards who treated even the youngest prisoners with respect. The confusion gnawed at him. How could the enemy be so normal? How could they show compassion to the very people who had been sent to destroy them? Klouse wrote page after page in his journal trying to make sense of it all. "They give us more food than I ate at home," he scribbled in German. "Why don't they hate us? We were the enemy. We destroyed their friends, but they treat us like people, not animals. I do not understand this." The turning point came one cold December morning when Sergeant Tom M. Loud, one of the camp guards, asked for volunteers to help decorate for Christmas. Klouse raised his hand, drawn by curiosity and the quiet dignity M. Loud always showed. As they unpacked boxes of ornaments and tinsel, Klouse's hands began to shake. He picked up a delicate glass ball painted with a snowy cottage, something out of a fairy tale, a world untouched by war. Suddenly, the weight of everything he'd lost crashed over him. He started to cry, unable to stop, the tears coming faster than he could wipe them away. M. Loud noticed. He set down his box and walked over, his voice gentle. "Hey, now it's okay." Klouse tried to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. M. Loud simply pulled him into a hug, a firm, steady embrace, the kind a father gives a son who's falling apart. For the first time since the war began, Klouse let himself be comforted. He realized in that moment that real strength wasn't about making others afraid. It was about having the courage to show mercy, even to those who didn't deserve it. Later, as they sat together on a bench, Loud spoke quietly about his own sons back in Ontario. He told Klouse, "You're just a kid, you shouldn't have been in a war at all." Those words hit harder than any blow. Klouse had spent years being told he was a soldier, a hero, a cog in the Nazi war machine. But here was his enemy telling him the truth. He was just a boy, caught in a nightmare he never chose. That night, Klouse wrote in his journal, "I thought power meant fear. The Canadians taught me that real power is choosing mercy when you could choose revenge." The propaganda that had ruled his life began to crumble, replaced by a new understanding, one built on kindness, forgiveness, and the simple, radical idea that even enemies can choose to be human. But the journey wasn't over. Klouse still had to face the ruins of his homeland, and the even harder task of rebuilding his life from the ashes of war. When the day finally came for Klouse to leave Camp 133, he stood on the deck of the ship, watching the Canadian coastline fade into the mist. In his canvas bag, he carried only a few belongings: a change of clothes, a bar of soap, a battered English-German dictionary, and 3 photographs that proved his time in Canada was real. As the ship cut through the Atlantic waves, Klouse tried to prepare himself for what waited on the other side. But nothing could have prepared him for the shock of returning to Germany. The journey home was long and uncertain. The ship docked in Bremen, and Klouse stepped onto German soil for the first time in 2 years. The port was a hive of activity, but everything looked gray and broken. Buildings stood with their walls missing, windows boarded up with scraps of wood. People moved through the streets with their heads down, shoulders hunched against the wind, clutching bags and bundles as they searched for food or fuel. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and desperation. Klouse boarded a train for Hamburg, but the journey was slow and painful. The tracks were damaged in so many places that the train had to stop and start, taking long detours around bombed-out sections. He pressed his face to the window, watching the German countryside roll past, fields that should have been green and growing, now choked with weeds and neglect. Villages were little more than shells, walls standing around empty spaces where homes had once been. Everywhere he looked, he saw the scars of war. Hamburg was worse than he had imagined. The city of his childhood was gone, replaced by endless piles of brick and twisted metal. Streets were nothing more than narrow paths cut through mountains of rubble. Children with hollow eyes played in the ruins, making games out of broken things. Klouse walked through the devastation, carrying his bag, tears streaming down his face. This was the price of war, the real cost, hidden behind every speech and every promise. He found his mother and aunt living in a tiny cottage outside the city, their faces lined with hunger and worry. When his mother opened the door and saw him, she broke down in tears, pulling him into a desperate embrace. She touched his face and arms as if she couldn't believe he was real. They sat at the kitchen table, sharing a thin soup made from potatoes and turnips. Klouse didn't tell her about the Christmas dinners in Canada, or the chocolate bars, or the 3,000-calorie meals. He didn't want to make her feel worse about what she couldn't provide. In the weeks that followed, Klouse helped repair the cottage and plant a garden. He used the English he'd learned in Canada to trade with British soldiers, getting better prices for the little they had to sell. He watched his neighbors struggle to rebuild their lives from nothing, clearing rubble with their bare hands, trying to find hope in a world that seemed determined to crush it. One day, his mother asked him what it had been like in the prison camp. Klouse pulled out his photographs and showed her the Henderson family at Christmas, the work crew on the farm, the smiling faces of people who had every reason to hate him but chose kindness instead. His mother stared at the pictures, confused. They invited you into their home, but you were the enemy, Klouse nodded. Yes, we were the enemy, but they treated us like people anyway. The contrast between his life in Canada and the ruins of Germany was almost too much to bear. Klouse realized that the real battle wasn't just about survival. It was about what kind of person he wanted to be in a world that had lost its way. The lessons he learned in Canada about mercy and forgiveness became his guide as he tried to rebuild not just his home, but his own sense of humanity. But Klouse's journey was far from over. The next chapter would test everything he had learned as he searched for a new purpose in a world forever changed by war. In the months after returning to Germany, Klouse found himself haunted by two worlds, one of devastation and hunger, the other of unexpected kindness and hope. The ruins of Hamburg were a daily reminder of everything he'd lost, but the memories of Canada lingered like a quiet promise that life could be different. As he helped his mother and aunt rebuild their tiny cottage, Klouse realized that survival was only the beginning. The real challenge was deciding what kind of man he wanted to become in a country desperate for healing. The lessons he'd learned in Camp 133 echoed in his mind. He remembered the Canadian guards who treated him with respect, the families who welcomed him at their tables, and the simple acts of mercy that had shattered years of propaganda. He thought about Sergeant M. Loud's words, "Real power is having the strength to choose mercy when you have every reason not to." Those words became a compass, guiding Klouse through the confusion and bitterness of post-war Germany. But finding a new purpose wasn't easy. The world around him was filled with anger and suspicion. Many Germans saw returning POWs as traitors or cowards, blaming them for the country's defeat. Others were too broken by loss to care about anything but survival. Klouse kept his memories of Canada close, but he rarely spoke of them. He knew that most people wouldn't understand how the enemy could become a friend, or how kindness could be stronger than hate. Still, Klouse felt a responsibility to do something more. He had seen firsthand what happened when children were taught to hate, when lies were repeated until they became truth. He remembered the fear and confusion of his own childhood, the way propaganda had twisted his sense of right and wrong. He didn't want another generation to grow up believing that cruelty was strength, or that enemies could never change. So Klouse made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would become a teacher. It wasn't easy. He worked odd jobs to save money, studied late into the night, and faced endless obstacles in a country struggling to rebuild. But he was determined. He wanted to stand in front of a classroom and teach children the lessons he had learned the hard way. That war is not glory, that real strength is found in forgiveness, and that every person deserves to be seen as human. When Klouse finally earned his teaching certificate, he felt a sense of pride he hadn't known since before the war. Standing in front of his first class, he looked at the young faces and made himself a promise. He would never let them glorify violence or fall for the same lies that had stolen his own childhood. He would teach them to question, to think for themselves, and to choose kindness even when it was hard. Sometimes his students asked about the war. Klouse never hid the truth. "I was a child in a soldier's uniform," he would say. "I was taught to hate people I had never met, but when I was captured, I learned that the real monsters were the ones who put rifles in the hands of children and called it duty." He showed them the photographs he had carried from Canada, the Henderson family at Christmas, the farm crew, the smiling faces of people who had every reason to hate him, but chose not to. Klouse's story became a quiet rebellion against the darkness of the past. In a world desperate for hope, he offered his students something rare: the belief that enemies could become friends, that hatred could end, and that the strongest choice was always kindness. His classroom became a place where the next generation could learn not just history, but humanity. But Klouse's journey didn't end there. The lessons he carried from Canada would shape not only his own life, but the lives of everyone he taught, proving that even in the aftermath of war, one person's choice to forgive can change the world. Years passed, but the memories of war and mercy never faded for Klouse. As Germany rebuilt itself from the ashes, Klouse built a new life grounded in the lessons he had learned as a prisoner in Canada. He became more than just a survivor. He became a living testament to the idea that even in the darkest times, kindness can change the course of a life. On his desk, Klouse kept 3 photographs in a simple wooden frame. One showed him standing with the Henderson family at Christmas, all of them smiling in front of a glowing tree. Another captured the work crew on Jack's farm, Klouse and the other prisoners standing shoulder to shoulder with their Canadian supervisors, the prairie sun bright in the background. The third was a picture of Sergeant Mloud's 2 sons, Tommy and Charlie, with a handwritten note on the back. Remember what boys should be. These images were more than keepsakes. They were proof that the world could be different, that enemies could become friends, and that compassion could survive even the worst of wars. As the years went by, Klouse's story became a quiet legend among his students and neighbors. Young people would visit him in his retirement, curious about the old man with the gentle eyes and the strange accent. They would ask about the war, about what it was like to be a child soldier, about how he survived. Klouse always told them the truth, never hiding the pain or the shame. "I was a child in a soldier's uniform," he would say. "I was taught to hate, but I learned that real strength is choosing mercy when you could choose revenge." He would show them the photographs, letting them see the faces of the Canadians who had every reason to hate him, but chose to treat him with dignity instead. He explained how the strongest thing a person can do is show kindness to someone who doesn't deserve it. "Power without mercy is just cruelty," he'd say. "But power with mercy can change the world." Klouse's message resonated far beyond his classroom. Former students wrote to him from across the world, sharing how his lessons had shaped their lives. Some became teachers themselves, others worked in peace organizations, and many simply tried to live with more empathy and understanding. Klouse's story became a bridge between generations, a reminder that the past doesn't have to dictate the future. Even as an old man, Klouse never forgot the faces of the boys he'd known in Camp 133, or the Canadian soldiers who had shown him a different way to be strong. He knew that the world was still full of conflict and division, but he believed that every act of kindness, no matter how small, could ripple outward and make a difference. In the end, Klouse's greatest legacy wasn't just the life he rebuilt, but the hope he inspired in others. His story proved that even in the aftermath of war, forgiveness is possible, and that the strongest choice is always to see the humanity in others, even those we're told to fear. The lesson he carried from Canada was simple but powerful. Enemies can become friends, hatred can end, and the world can be healed, one act of mercy at a time. And that, more than any victory on the battlefield, is what it truly means to be strong.